Hi there, my name is Patrick Denny and welcome to this presentation about the Colchester cloth trade. You'll notice if you look at my slide, my opening slide here, my strap line, if you like, says that it's 500 years of industry. Now, to be truthful, we don't actually know when the cloth trade in Colchester actually began, but we know it finished in the mid 1830s, and there's evidence that it started sometime in the 13th or 14th century, but certainly 500 years I think must be taken as a minimum. It may well have been quite a bit longer than that. But without further ado, let's make a start, and we'll go to our first slide. And I thought we would be good to have a look at some of these early references about when we think the cloth trade may have got started, if you like, locally. So the first one is, well, it's actually a negative, I suppose, because something, a former record called a pipe roll in 1202, where it had a list of all the cloth making towns in England, Colchester didn't get a mention. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that there wasn't a cloth making industry here at that time, but it may suggest that it wasn't sufficiently well established to be included with other major towns and cities that were doing that. But in 1247, there's mention of a fulling mill in the Liberty. Now, a fulling mill is part of the process of the cloth trade, which we'll discuss later on. And the fact that it's actually using a mill, that's a kind of mechanized form, one would have thought by then that the trade is fairly well on its way. In the Liberty, well, the liberties, there's the four liberties of Colchester, Lexton, Mile End, Grinstead and West Donnellan, these outlying districts. And this may well have been at Lexton. In 1249, the records show that Henry III purchased 20 russet cloths in Colchester to clothe his servants. Russet cloths were a particular speciality with the Colchester cloth makers, and they were actually a kind of grey colour. But as time went on, they came to be known as Colchester russets. So he had a name attached to them, so famous were we for doing them. In 1265, taxation records show various surnames such as Draper, Dyer, Fuller, Weaver, all surnames associated with people who may have been involved in the cloth trade, because we know in early years, surnames often took the names of what people's occupation was at the time. And then finally, certainly by 1300, this is taxation record from that year, and it shows that in Colchester, cloth making and people associated with the woolen industry was the second largest occupation in the town at that time after agriculture. And it was just ahead of the leather industry. So certainly by the end of the 12th century, early 14th century, certainly cloth making is well underway. Statutes relating to the cloth industry, these are quite important because in the early days, it seems that much of the wool that was produced in this country was sent abroad to be made up by foreign workers. And then we bought it back again, if you like. But in order to bolster the home trade, we see here Henry I, for example, states that if any cloth is found to be made of Spanish wool mixed with English wool, apparently what they did, the mayor of London should see it burnt. In other words, he's encouraging the workers to use English wool only. And by the 1330s, in fact, Edward III brought out various statutes, namely to start with, look, no English wool should be exported to the continent. So that was it. No English wool should be exported. Wool can come in, but the wool that we produce is for the home market. And he goes on to say underneath, look, so although he's stopping wool going abroad, he's encouraging the foreign workers to come to England. And he says, all the cloth workers of strange lands, of whatsoever country they may be, which shall come into England, Ireland, Wales and Scotland, within the king's power, shall come safely and surely, and shall be in the king's protection. Our sovereign lord the king will grant them franchises, as many and such as may suffice them. So this was encouraging foreign workers with their skills to come to our country, to come into England and produce cloth in this country. Here we've got a map showing These are all towns and villages in North Essex and Suffolk engaged in cloth making communities. In fact, before the Industrial Revolution really took off in the north of England in the 18th century, places like East Anglia, East Anglia was one of the main industrial heartlands of this country. And communities, and we can see some of the smaller ones here in the centre, from Dedham, Stratford, East Burgott, and Colchester, Hadley, Lavenham, all the way through to Norfolk, right up to Norwich. Thousands of people were involved in the cloth trade. And although agriculture was obviously a major industry, the coastal trades, but you've got to imagine for 500-600 years, looms pounding away in all villages and towns throughout the whole region, and thousands of people would have earned their living from the cloth trade. It's been suggested that to produce one piece of cloth could have involved the contribution of maybe up to 50 different people. And we'll be having a look at some of those in a moment. So we know that certainly around Colchester alone and the greater area around Colchester, tens of thousands of people made their living attached to this industry. So I thought we'd start off by having a look at some of the stages of manufacture of the cloth trade, and we'll see some of the occupations that are aligned to that. They all relied upon each other. You'll see I've got at the top here woolen and worsted cloth. Now this will become apparent in a moment. But first of all, of course, the sheep have got to be reared. So sheep farming, top of the list, and shearing. The fleece has to come off and be prepared. And depending on the kind of sheep, some sheep are bred with longer fleeces for various processes. Some have got shorter fleeces, but whatever fleece it has, it's got to be sorted and graded and possibly cleaned. Although it will be cleaned later on, it's probably got to be cleaned at this stage as well. And with any fleece, you can imagine the wool on the top or the back or the shoulders is going to be much better quality than maybe on the legs or the thighs. So they take the wool they need for different processes, but that all has to be done, and there's an occupation of doing that all the time. Down the bottom, we've then got the wool dealer or the stapler. Now he's the person who's going to deal in wool. He's going to buy it all up and keep it in some kind of warehouse and sell it on, etc. And that would also certainly later have been done by the bottom occupation, the clothier himself. Up until about 1400, most of the different processes like spinning, fulling, weaving, all involved in the manufacture of woolen cloth, was probably managed by the individual occupations. So they would do their bit and then pass it on to someone else, and so on and so forth. But from about 1400, and certainly after that, these people who called themselves clothiers, these wool manufacturers, if you like, they controlled the whole process. So they bought the wool in to start with, they employed spinners, they employed weavers, they employed fullers, and they made sure that once the wool had passed through a certain process, it was passed around backwards and forwards. They controlled all of that. Kept prices down where they could, of course, but at the end of the day, all the profit was theirs, and most of these clothiers became fabulously wealthy, very, very wealthy indeed. Here we've got a typical fleece. It looks quite nice, but if you was to zoom in on it, you'd soon see that it's not necessarily very clean. And even once you've cleaned all the straw and bits of soil off the fleece, the wool itself is matted and tangled. You certainly couldn't really take that and spin yarn from it. So it's all got to be untangled and dematted. And there's various ways of doing that. Two main ways is either carding, and you can see on the left we've got these cards. These are little bat type instruments they're full of tiny little nails, which they pull the wool with those. And on the right, and the other one is combing. And we can see on the right, we've got two combs. Now these are, again, quite small. You hold them in the hand, but they've got these very long prongs. And it depended what kind of cloth you wanted to produce, which method you would use. Traditionally, if you was making woolen cloth, the wool would be carded to start with. And once the wool had been carded, it would be spun into yarn and so forth. And once the wool had been woven into cloth using this process of carding, the very final cloth would, if you were to feel it, it would have a sort of fluffy like feel to it. Whereas if you was making worsted cloth, you would comb the wool to start with, and that produces a different kind of wool, which we'll come on to in a moment. And if you make that up into cloth, rather than being a sort of fluffy feel, it's very smooth and flat. Let's have a look a bit further. So here we've got an example of wool that's been matted and tangled all up. And this particular example showing after it's been combed, you can see all the fibers are now all sort of running nice and loosely. And that's an ideal situation there to be spun up into yarn. But let's have a look first of all at carding there. Now this carding was carried out mainly by women. It was certainly a home cottage industry, and you know, tens of thousands of women around all these towns would have made their living preparing this wool, carding the wool, ready for it to be passed on to the spinners to be made into yarn. And of course, someone's got to make the cards, the actual cards they use. That's another occupation supporting the wool, and the combs, of course. But what she would do, she would hold one of these little cards in her hand and put some wool onto it, onto these little nails, these little prongs. And then with the clean card, she would pull the wool off of one card, transferring all of this wool onto the other one. And then she would reverse it and pull it all back again. So from backwards and forwards, and the more you pull, you're untangling this wool, and it's becoming nice and free and nicely ready to pass on to the spinners. Now, I thought I'd just throw this in before we move on to the other one. In many churches in particular around the country, that were in these cloth making communities, you can see something there's usually some kind of decoration or something in the church relating to the cloth trade, which was very popular in their area. Now in this church, St Andrew's Church at Norton in Suffolk, if you go inside, and you'll see some medieval choir stalls. These are what they call misericords. So this is a modern one in front here, but these are the older ones. And you'll see there's a flap, the seat flaps up. So if you want to sit down, you pull it down, and then when you're standing up, you pull it up. Now, some of these clergy in the old days, apparently, when they had to stand up for long periods during these services, probably got a bit tired. So someone came up with a novel idea of putting a little ledge on the seat. So when the seat is folded up, there's like this little tiny ledge, not very big, but you could just about rest yourself on it if you like. So although it looked as though you might be standing up, you were sort of resting your weight on this little ledge. But in order for this little ledge to support it when weight was put on it, they always put these little carvings underneath. You can see there's a carving underneath here, look. There's a carving under that one. They all had carvings. These little misericords are called. And they're all different. In fact, someone has written a book. It's a social history of England based on these misericord carvings. And these carvings tended to reflect the kind of local industry that might have been prevailing wherever it was. So if it was in like an agricultural area, you might have a carving of a horse or a plough or something like this. But certainly in St Andrew's Church here at Norton, this was a cloth making community. And what you've got, the little carving, look, is of a woman carding wool. So keep your eyes open for that. There's quite a few. You'll sometimes see them on the end of the pews, carvings on the wood there. Moving on to combing then. Now, as I said, combing is if you would comb the fleece, the wool rather, if you wanted to produce worsted cloth. And later on, we're going to be talking about the bay trade in Colchester. If you wanted to make bay cloth, you would also comb the wool. This was often done by men. It was sometimes a bit of a dirty, heavy job. And if you can see the two illustrations of these combs either side at the top, but down the bottom, you'll see there's a man doing this. There's like a little heater kind of fire here because the combs have to be kept heated all the time. So you use 2 of them at any one time, but you'd probably have a few spares heated up. And what you would do, you can probably see on this right-hand picture, you would fix one of these combs, look, with the prongs upright on this bracket on the wall, put some wool, put a quantity of wool onto that comb, and then with the other comb, you would strike downwards in a downward fashion, pulling all the wool from one comb, pulling it down and transferring it basically onto your other comb. And by doing this, you're straightening and pulling all the wool fibers. And then once that had happened, you would take the comb that wool has been transferred on and swap everything over. Put that on the wall and strike down with the other one. And you keep doing that as long as you need it. And eventually, if you look on this right picture, look, he's pulling off a long, it's called a sliver. It's a long sliver of wool that has all been untangled. And these would be a yard or a metre or so in length. And then they would be tied up in like a skein or a hank, ready to go on to the spinners for weaving. And if you was to look at both processes, wool that's been carded and wool that's been combed under close magnification, on the left here, you'll see the carded wool. Although it's been untangled, it's been dematted, it's right ready, the fibers are still running in a kind of higgledy-piggledy fashion. They're running in all directions. As I said earlier, if you was to spin this and make cloth with this wool, the finished article would have this sort of fluffy appearance as you get with woolen cloth. But on the other side, on the carded wool, where it's been combed, and they tend to use longer fleeces for this process, but you can clearly see that the fibers are not running so higgledy-piggledy. They're almost running parallel with each other. And of course, when you spin this and weave this into cloth, it has a very sort of flat appearance. It feels flat, like worsted suits do, or people remember buying worsted suits. So the next process, of course, having carded the wool or combed it, it has to be spun into yarn. This was very much again a cottage industry. Women did this in their own homes. Children got involved as well. The traditional method on the left was with a distaff and a spindle. The wool is all on the distaff, and people could walk around doing this, and almost while you're walking around or perhaps doing something else. But later on, of course, the spinning wheel came into fashion, and that improved as well as time went on. And I don't think there was many probably cottages or houses that didn't have 1 or 2 or more spinning wheels, because this is how they earned their money. Dyeing was another thing. Much of the wool was dyed into various colours, rather than just leaving it plain colour. Some people wanted it blue, red, or various other colours. So the wool had to be dyed. This was another major process in the cloth making industry. And if you look down the bottom line there, I've said that this dyeing could actually take place at different stages of the process. First of all, it could be dyed in the wool. Now, by dyeing in the wool, it means you dye it right in its raw state. So once it's maybe been combed and it would all be dyed, and then it would be spun into yarn, dyed. Or it could be dyed in the yarn. So once the spinners have spun it into yarn, it could be dyed then. But more often than not, it was dyed in the cloth, or sometimes it's called in the piece, and that's after it's been woven. So once it's been woven up by the weaver, then it would be dyed before it goes to the customer. Now, with the bay trade in Colchester, for example, which we'll come on to later, most of the bays were not dyed at all. They were left in their natural state, sent to London, then from there maybe to Southern Europe or somewhere to their customers, and they let the customer choose what colour they wanted to dye it themselves, which seems quite sensible, really. But anyway, dyeing did take place, another major industry, and in particular in Lavenham, most of their cloth that they produced, the broadcloths, they dyed blue. And of course, their cloths were well known as Lavenham blues. And they dyed them in those days with a natural product called woad. Now, from this plant called woad, they would produce these woad balls, if you like. And the woad, plant is apparently related to the cabbage family. And you know, people can still grow it. But apparently what would happen, you'd produce these woad, you get these woad balls from the process from the plant, and then you would get your vat ready. You can see the vat on the right, at the top in particular, and you would put your water in and what else you want to put in there, and you would put a certain quantity of this woad in there as well, and then you put your wool in, or your cloth, or whatever you wanted to put in. In this case, we've got some wool, and you would leave that wool in there overnight to soak in this woad mixture. And in the morning, you would, once it's worked its magic, if you like, you would take the wool out. And this is the interesting thing. You'll see at the top right, when you first take the wool out, it seems to be the same color as what you put it in the night before. But within seconds, as soon as that wool has hit the atmosphere, as it were, you'll see down the bottom there, it turns into this blue color. And of course, to alter the shade or the deepness of the blue color would depend probably on how much woad you put in. But it was particularly dyeing with woad could be a very smelly business, as told by Tony Robinson in his book. If you haven't seen this, it's worth looking at. Down the bottom there, look, the worst jobs in history. And one of the jobs he highlighted in the book was woad dyeing. Let's see what he had to say. He said, the problem was the smell. It is difficult to describe the stench on paper. Put it like this. How far away from a bad smell would you consider a safe distance? Queen Elizabeth, this is the first, not only ordered woad dyers to stop work completely before she travelled through a town, she also decreed they shouldn't come within 5 miles of where she was staying. And he says here, look, cooked woad smells like rotting cabbage mixed with sewage. So not a very nice or very clean occupation. So anyway, once the wool has been spun into yarn, and maybe it's been dyed at that time, it then has to be woven into cloth. And there we have the hand loom weavers. Now, although the spinners and the carders could live some distance from the clothier, you know, in Colchester, some of the clothiers in Colchester were employing women 20, 30 miles away, over the Cambridgeshire border even. But the weavers tended to be fairly local. So here we've got on the left, a man, just one man at a loom, weaving cloth. And on the right-hand side, another man appears to be a much larger loom. Now, it all depended what kind of cloth he was making. But typically English broadcloth, for example, and some of the cloth in Colchester, the Colchester russet cloth, could be up to 2 yards wide. In Colchester, the length varied from 12 yards to 24 yards, but typically English broadcloth was probably up to 2 yards wide by about 28 yards long. Now, if you've got cloth 2 yards wide and you're sitting at a loom, and you've got to pass the shuttle, look, you see he's got the shuttle, the threads running this way along the loom are the warp threads, and the threads going across are the weft. And what the man in the loom does, by operating a pedal on the floor, he can raise every other warp thread, and then he passes the weft thread, which is attached to the shuttle, through and gets it the other end, and then he operates the pedals again, puts it back, and that's how they weave the thread. But unless you've got, you know, arms like a gorilla, there's no way you could do that on your own if the cloth you're weaving is 2 yards wide. So quite often you'd have two weavers sitting side by side if you are weaving wide cloth. Or if not, you certainly have someone helping you pass the shuttle backwards and forwards. But if it's a narrow cloth, then of course you could manage to do that quite on your own. We have an experience from a later weaver who was weaving cloth up to 2 yards in width, and he said that a good weaver could probably weave about 5 yards in a day. So if you're trying to do 25 plus yards, it's going to take a week, roughly a whole week, for one weaver to make one piece of cloth. And you can imagine at the height of the trade in some communities in Colchester, in the later years, they were producing like nearly 1,000 cloths a week. It's keeping 1,000 weavers or more fully employed. Once the cloth has been woven, it has to be fulled. Now, this again, I'm going to go back to Tony Robinson because he also speaks about fulling. The fulling process is where the cloth had to be dipped into this liquid mixture once it's been woven, and what would actually, it had to be agitated. Now, in the early days, you actually got into a vat like Tony Robinson was demonstrating, and you trod on it backwards and forwards. And the end result was to degrease everything, to scour it, to clean it, but it also had the effect of thickening all the weave together. So, but it was a kind of a dirty job, because one of the products they put into the water that they put it into was urine, human urine. And they used to go around people's houses to collect it. You would leave your pot of urine out, if you like, on a Friday night, and someone would come and collect it out, maybe pay you a penny or something for the privilege. But very early on, this was one of the first parts of the trade was mechanized, and we read right at the beginning of a fulling mill. So usually this was done in a mill, but traditionally this was the old-fashioned way. And this, let's hear what he had to say. Again, he says, nothing can prepare you for the raw meat smell of stale urine. The ammonia it gives off is so strong that it makes you want to vomit every time you breathe in. But I proved beyond doubt that the process worked. Even after a few minutes, the grease was clearly oozing out of the cloth and into the urine. Now, it does work, but the only problem is, as Tony Robinson further explains in the book, someone would have to stand doing that for 5 hours or more a day to do that. And all the time, every few minutes, you've got to stop and turn the cloth over, move it round. You've got to put your hands in all this, because if you keep tramping on the same spot, you'll wear a hole in the cloth. You're being all the work that's been done, all the weaving. No way you can afford to have it damaged at this stage. So it has to be regularly turned. But anyway, have a look at that. That's quite interesting. But for generally speaking, it would be done in a fulling mill. And we had fulling mills all around Colchester and all around the communities who were making cloth. And on the left-hand side, you can see a fulling stock. They're like, imagine a giant wooden mallet with a long pole, you know, maybe 6 foot long, with a massive hammerhead at the end. And if you look on this illustration, you can see the water wheel. So the water's coming along here, and it's making this wheel turn around here. And there's these little tappets all the way around the wheel. And these are these large fulling stocks in position. Look, there they are. And underneath the bottom of where these big hammers are, this big bit at the bottom here, is where they would stack the wool. So they would stack the cloth there, fold it all up, put it in there. And then as the wheel turns round, these tappets catch on the edge of these hammers and lift them up. And when it gets to a certain stage, the wheel will release the hammer and it thuds back onto the cloth. And it keeps doing this all the time. And it's pounding the cloth. And it's already been soaked in this urine and what have you. And it has the effect of this cleaning it and thickening it. Now, the interesting thing is, you remember what I said about in the old fashioned way, you had to keep turning the cloth. If not, you'd hammer or tramp a hole into it. If you look on the edge of these hammers, look on the left picture first, you'll see the funny shape on the edge of that mallet. Look, can you see that there? The stock head. And you can see it on here. Someone at some stage came up with this ingenious plan that, providing you've got that little shape, every time it comes down and hits the cloth, it turns the cloth just a little bit. Because of that shape, it keeps turning the cloth. So although this process might only go on in a fulling mill for, say, half an hour, every time the stock falls onto the cloth, it turns it slightly. So all of the cloth is getting equally fulled. And here we've got another picture of some fulling stocks that's been preserved in situ in a museum or in someone's house. You can see the big hammer stock end. Look, there's the big hand, and that's the head, and the cloth is in this part here, and that would be going up and down, pounding away there. Now there is this textile mill, the Helmshire textile mill in Lancashire. I'm not sure if anyone's been there. I'm not sure it's actually open at the moment. They did close it for a while, but I think it's opening again at certain times of the year for holidays. But they've got a fantastic, lots of implements to do with the cloth trade there, including about this fulling. And they've got this original little barrel here on a little two-wheeled cart look that they used to take round the village or around the houses collecting the urine from people. And they would fill this up, and they'd probably have several barrels. They'd change them over because they needed this for the fulling process. And they would pay people maybe a penny for a pot or a pail of your urine. But apparently, if you were Methodists, okay, you got twopence. If you had ginger hair, you got twopence. With the Methodists, I suppose they didn't drink, so they thought that their urine was a better quality. Let's see what it says, look. Lant, they called it, urine, as it was known, was collected locally from pots people left on their doorsteps and from collecting places in the street. They would pay the householder about a penny a pail or pot. But Methodists and people with red hair were paid twice as much because their urine was considered to be of a better quality. So that's interesting. Let's move on. Having gone through the fulling process, and don't forget it's had this urine on it, it's dirty, it has to be thoroughly washed. So there'll be a local stream or a pond, it will all be washed, and then what happens? It's wet. Now what happens with wet wool? It will shrink. So straight away, it not only does it have to be dried, it has to be kept taut and tight and stretched so it doesn't shrink. So it then goes on to tenter frames. And here we've got an illustration at the top, an old illustration of a whole length of cloth. And don't forget, this could be at least 25 to 30 yards long, being put onto the tenter frames where it will stay there and it will dry in the open air. And at the bottom image, these are some original tenter frames at Otterburn Mill in Northumberland. And how they would work, you've got the top rail and there's lots of little bent nails or hooks. And what would happen, you'd probably need a couple of people to help you do this, but you would hook the cloth all the way along the top on these nails here, and then you would hit the bottom edge on this bottom rail. But this bottom rail, although this was fixed, the top rail, the bottom rail you could slide up and down. So once you've got the wool on, you would then push the bottom rail down as far as you dare and then fix it so it's nice and tight. You can't do it too tight, because if you tighten it too much, it could split. Again, think of all the work that's been done. So it's a skilled job. It has to be done at the right. And it's kept nice and taut while it's dried. You know, hence the saying, I'm on tenterhooks. You're highly strung. You're taut. So that would hang on there. And if you just look on here, we can see close up some of these hooks, look, that they would hook the cloth on from the bottom rail. So that's another major process. And if we look around, this is Colchester. This is a prospect of Colchester in 1724. And most of the open ground in Colchester had tenter frames on. And here we can see, this is the Norman bank behind the castle. That's where you can walk along top of the bank now. This is the little Roman wall at the bottom. But this would be like the slope. You know, the slope that goes down to the Roman wall, and you can see all the tenter frames here, look. This land was owned by Charles Gray at the time, who lived in Holly Trees, and they would rent the land off him, and you can see some cloth workers coming over here and some cloth on one of those tenter frames. On another part of the plan, this area here, this is North Hill, that's St. Peter's Church. That's when the tower was in the middle of the church, not on the end like it is now. There's North Gate. That's the only real image we've got of North Gate, the medieval gate that went right across the street. People lived above it, look. But over here, this is where the sixth form college is now in Colchester. And look at the field, is absolutely full of tenter frames. The next process, we still haven't finished roughing. or rowing, it's called. Once the cloth has been through the fulling process, been dried, it then has to be roughed. And what would happen traditionally, they would hang the cloth on a frame and then use a little piece here to hold these teasel heads. Now this is another occupation. Someone had to grow the teasel heads. They used thousands of them. We know in some of the fields around Markstay and places beyond towards Colchester, they grew lots and lots of teasels for the cloth trade. But what they would do, they would hang the cloth up and they would get these little bats, put all the teasels on them and rub the teasels against the nap of the cloth. So whichever the natural way the cloth was running, they would run it the other way to raise the nap, to bring the nap up. Okay, once they'd done that, the nap had been raised, they had to trim it off so it was nice and flat. And how they did it, that was another occupation called shearing. Now this is not shearing the fleece, this is shearing the raised nap. And they used, this is absolutely remarkable, these massive great shears, look. You see on the illustration on the right and over on the left picture, you can see some shears hanging over on the wall. They were basically like a very long blade that had been bent round and fixed together with a spring. And very carefully, very skillfully, very deftly, they would trim off with these massive shears the excess that had been raised by these roughers raising the nap. You know, you would imagine they would use tiny little scissors or something, but no, they used these massive great shears. Once, let's just see if we can move on to the next slide. Once that's gone on, this is almost the finish. We've got the finishing room and we can see lots of things going on here. First of all, we can see someone rolled some cloth out and he's sprinkling it with water. Then it will go up on the frame for the teasels to raise the nap, makes it a bit easier. And then it will go onto these benches where the shearers are trimming off all the raised nap. And then if you look through here, it's then being ironed, if you like. It's being pressed. And what they would do for pressing, they would have these very heavy iron slabs, weights, which would be heated up, and that's how they would press it. And once that's been done, it's almost ready for being packed up and dispatched to the final customer. So I think you agree, a massive industry that kept tens of thousands of people busy, employed. And I thought you'd like to see this. This is called the Draper's Window from a church of Notre Dame in Semur-en-Auxois in France. And it depicts, interestingly, most of the processes that we've just been talking about. In the top left, they're sorting the wool at the beginning. This one showing the carding process. Here we are dyeing the wool. This one, of course, is weaving. Note, two weavers sitting together. The center one, he's doing a Tony Robertson. This is dyeing the wool. Here he's roughing or rowing, they called it, raising the nap with these teasel heads. And then the shearer is trimming off the raised nap, and then it's being pressed in the final image. So that's really how the process progressed. But Colchester got a massive boost to the cloth trade in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, it's called the Colchester Bay Trade. What we're looking at is an image here from Chapman Andre's map of Colchester, which was published in 1777. We're looking at a fulling mill, and cloth is being delivered to the mill where it's going to be fulled, and then it will be washed, and then it will move on to the tenter frames. But how did the Bay Trade begin? Well, in 1565, in what were called the Spanish Netherlands, the part of the Low Countries, and particularly around the Flanders area, many Protestants were being very cruelly persecuted by the Catholic King of Spain, basically. And they were in fear of their lives. There really was. And many of these Flemish people, these Protestants, fled to England to escape. And many of them settled in Colchester. They settled in lots of other towns, particularly on the east and the south coast. In fact, the bailiffs of Colchester actually petitioned the Queen's Privy Council to let some of these refugees come and settle in our town of Colchester. You know, this is going to cost money for somebody, and you could be forgiven for thinking that, you know, refugees, you know, try somewhere else. We don't want to take, but they wanted them here. And the reason why, because they thought they were going to be industrious. They were going to help the community. And one of the reasons was that most of them were expert cloth makers. Now, whereby everything we've been speaking about right through the medieval period earlier, we had been making English broadcloth. English broadcloth is a heavy duty cloth. It's not fine quality. It's kind of League Two, if you like. But these Flemings produced what came to be known as lightweight cloths. Bays, Says, Perpetuanas, and all sorts of other ones. These were much higher quality, and these were favoured by the rich and the aristocracy. You know, it was a much better way. So they were encouraging these bay makers to come and settle here. And what happened? It snowballed. Within 20 or 30 years, over 1,000 of these Dutch had settled here. Not all were bay makers, many were gardeners, but most of them were bay makers. And before long, they were given full control of making bays in Colchester and all the surrounding districts. And as a result, nobody wanted broadcloths anymore. Broadcloths were yesterday. It was old-fashioned. And that was one of the reasons why the Lavenham trade came to almost an abrupt halt, because the bay trade in Colchester, everybody was wanting to do bays, making bays. Now, when these this community first arrived, they kept very much in their own community, in as much that they married within their own community. They spoke their own language, but of course, as time went on, they were assimilated into the local population. On this map here, this is where that picture comes from, although this is black and white. That's that people delivering the meal to that cloth here, look. Can you see that on the corner of the image there? But even if you look at this map, this is the Chapman-Andre town plan of 1777. You can see here, look, tenter frames in the field. You can see tenter frames in the fields here. And if you look very carefully on that slope in the Castle Park, you can see the tenter frames we spoke of there. But look, this is Colchester as it would have looked about the time these Flemish immigrants came to Colchester. This is a view of Colchester by someone called William Smith, dating from 1588. And it shows this is the town wall running all the way around here. And most people, look, live within inside the town. You can see why you might be reluctant to having a whole group of people coming in. Where are they going to live, for one thing? But anyway, that's what it was like. And these immigrants fitted in to this town here. And there ended up, you know, by the early 1620s, there was well over 1,000 of them, about a 10% of the population of the town. To start with, you'll see the details here. In 1565, to start with, there was 11 families arrived, 55 in number. By 1571, that had risen to 130, and that included some old Flemish residents. There were some Flemings who'd been here for 30 or 40 years. By 1573, it had grown to 534. And certainly at this period, there was a survey done where we get this figure from. And most of these immigrants, over 500 of them, are all being boarded out, mostly being boarded out with local residents all over town. And on the survey, it actually gives you the name of the person they're living with. So, you know, it's going to take time before they can build and get their own properties. By 1586, this is about 20 years after arriving, there's 1,292. And by 1622, 1,535. That was established by a census. They started to worry a bit. It was getting a bit too large. So it kind of settled to about 1,500. You can see down the bottom here. But they were given full oversight of the making of bays in Colchester. And based on their expertise, Colchester shot up really. And Colchester flourished for the next 2 centuries based on the expertise of these immigrants that came into the town and the production of bays mainly, but also says. And there's just a view look of the Low Countries, particularly the Spanish Netherlands, which today would be what, you know, modern day Belgium and Luxembourg, but it also included parts of Holland and parts of France. But this was also Flanders. The Spanish Netherlands, the Spanish name is Flandre, and that's where the Flanders comes from. Virtually all of them came from Flanders, that came in the 1560s onwards. And they settled in Colchester. Now, you're looking at two views of what we know as the Dutch Quarter, and certainly lots of these baymakers, these Flemings, would have lived here in the Dutch Quarter, but not necessarily all of them. It would be wrong to think that it's called the Dutch Quarter because this is where they were all hemmed in, if you like, where they all lived. That's not the case. In fact, the Dutch Quarter, which is about a quarter of the area inside the town wall of Colchester, is about 25 or so acres, and it's part of several parishes. So we've got part of St Peter's Parish, St Martin's, St Nicholas, and St Runwald's. But we know that the Flemings were living all over the town, in Alps and Buttles Parish. Some were living down the Hive, some were living in St Mary. Obviously, a lot were living here as well, but where it got the name the Dutch Quarter is probably a more 20th century. Although they spoke Dutch, and they were referred to as the Dutch, this area wasn't actually called the Dutch Quarter at the time. This is the Dutch Bay Hall. Apparently they started using this in the early 1600s, and this is where, particularly on the upper floor here, is where all the cloth, every single piece of cloth that was made in Colchester, every piece of bay cloth, had to be brought to the Dutch Bay Hall to be inspected at least twice during the processes, and then it was given special seals as a guarantee of quality. And when a bay cloth was delivered anywhere in the world, predominantly to Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, the Americas, when someone saw a Dutch bay seal, they didn't look anymore. They knew it was going to be of a high quality. So this is where the fire office stands now. It's on the same spot, and it's interesting that when the fire office was built, we've got these classical colonnade, and you had a colonnade here with the old Dutch Bay Hall. Interestingly, I thought you might be interested in this, in the Celia Fiennes, the travel writer. She came to Colchester, and she must have seen that Bay Hall. This is part of what she said, look, and don't forget, she came in about late 1690s. So by then the bay trade is really going well, and it's probably the height of the industry. She said there is a long building with stalls where they lay their bays when exposed to sale. I've retained some of the old spelling. Great quantities are made here and sent in bales to London. The whole town is employed in spinning, weaving, washing, drying and dressing the bays, in which they seem very industrious. The town looks a thriving place. It was thriving, and in the late 17th century on into the 18th century, the process continued. Although in the later 18th century a decline set in, but at this period that she was here was very prosperous. And I'm just showing you here 4 buildings in Colchester, which you all know at the top of, or the lower part of High Street. These were all owned by prosperous baymakers. You know, we've got William Boys and Sarah Boys here, Arthur Winsley, Isaac Boggess and his sons later, and Nathaniel Lawrence on East Hill. These were all people who made their fortunes as bay manufacturers or clothiers in the bay trade. The officers of the Dutch Bay Hall that we spoke of earlier, there was 24 of them, I believe, in total, and they all had to be sworn in every year, and there was all different sorts. There was people called white haulers, raw haulers, and so on. Talk more about that in a moment. This is dated 1727, which was actually the final swearing in, because the following year, the Dutch Bay Company was wound up. So the Dutch were no longer in control after that, but English clothiers took over and kept the trade going. You'll see there's originally some tokens attached to this, and there's a couple of them here. These were trade tokens that were published by, produced in place of small change, farthings or halfpennies, by not only bay makers but various other people. And this one was 1794. It shows Colchester Castle on one side, and it's got a loom, a weaving loom on the other side, and it's got written on here, success to the bay trade. But let's look at those in a bit more clearer writing. So there was 50, so every year they would have to elect these different people. There was 15 raw haulers. So if you're doing your family history, you might go back and find out that your ancestor was a raw hauler, or he might have been a white hauler underneath. Look. Now, apparently, when the cloth had been woven, he'd been through all the spinning and everything, once he had woven the cloth, before it goes to the fulling mill, every weaver had to take his cloth up to the raw haul, where it was inspected. And if it was too short, not wide enough, hadn't been woven properly, the Dutch wouldn't put their seals on. Not only Dutch workers, but all the English weavers had to do the same, which they were bitterly opposed to doing. They tried to get out of it, but there was various royal decrees came down that the Dutch remain in control. You have to do it. If not, you won't work in Colchester, ultimately. So the raw haul was where the finished cloth had to be inspected. Once it's got past that, it can go on to the other processes, which includes fulling, roughing, etc., etc. And then at the end of that process, it all has to come back to the white hall, where it's further inspected and goes through other, gets other seals attached to it, depending what kind of cloth it is. And if we look down the list, there's things called measurers, high measurers, bailiffs, searchers of the tenters, probably making sure that the cloth is being dried in the correct way, and so on and so forth. The bay cloth itself was a much longer cloth than traditional cloth. In length, it was anything up to 48 yards long, and usually about 3/4 or so of a yard wide, between 54 and 63 inches. We spoke about Colchester russet in the past. That often was just 12 yards long, could be 24 yards, but it was usually 2 yards wide, or again, it could be a half size. They had something called straights, which were half the standard size. So the standard russet, we'll say, was 24 yards by 2 yards, whereas the half one would be 12 yards by only a yard wide, or they could mix it up a little bit. And the bottom here, a standard broadcloth, used most areas in the country, this is according to a 1552 Act, was between 28 and 30 yards long, at least 63 inches wide, but usually 2 yards. You often find references to the cloth trade also in overseers' poor accounts. I just want to share this with you. This is the Harwich overseers' accounts. I don't know if you can read this, but these are expenditures for the poor. So we can see here, for half a yard of bays for Wing's child. Half a yard, that's not much, is it? And you might think, oh, that's nice of them. They're buying a piece of cloth to make Wing's child a little coat or something, perhaps, of bay cloth. But when you keep reading down, it says, paid for strong beer for the burying of Wing's child, and then for Wing's child's coffin. So it wasn't, they weren't buying a little coat or anything. This was the Burial in Woolen Act. In 1666 and later in 1678, the government brought out the Burial in Woolen Act. Some say this was to bolster the wool trade, because, and particularly with Colchester, most of the cloth that was manufactured here, they put all their eggs in one basket. It all went to Southern Europe mostly. And whenever we had a war with Spain or France, the trade went through the doldrums. There were boom periods, but there were also slumps as well. And in order to try and get over these slumps, the government brought out the Burial in Wool Act. And that meant that every person who died had to be wrapped in a shroud made from English sheep's wool. And not only that, the coffin had to be lined with sheep's wool. And it was rigidly enforced, and you were fined. Your heirs, if you like, came after you. If that didn't happen, could be fined £5, which was an awful lot of money. But even people in the poorhouse had to be buried in this woolen cloth. And sometimes they were issued with a certificate. It's certainly mentioned in the burial registers, but sometimes you might find one of these. This is actually from Luton. It's got a skull and crossbones on there, look, which is, you know, a symbol of mortality, really, death. It says, to the Reverend, the Minister of Luton, that Susan Punter of the parish of Luton in the county of Bedford make oath that the body of Mary Kingham of this parish, which was lately buried at the burial ground of the Baptist Meeting House, so she's making this oath, this swearing an affidavit here, it was not wrapped up when buried in any suit, sheet or shroud, but was of sheep's wool only, nor was it put into any coffin, lined or faced with any kind of cloth or stuff, but sheep's wool only, according to the Act. It says down the bottom, look, no affidavits of burial in woolen must be delivered to the minister of the parish where the deceased was buried in 8 days from the time of burial, on pain of the penalty of £5 for neglect. And here we've got St Martin's Church in Colchester. Now, this is in the heart of what we now call, of course, the Dutch Quarter. But if you look over to the right of the church, this is East Stockwell Street in the background, you'll see a wall there, and you'll see 2 stone tomb tops, slabs, lying there. And if you look at one of them, sorry, I went the wrong way. If you look at one of them, you'll see here that it's got this skull and crossbones. I don't know if you can see that there, the skull and crossbones there, look. And this tombstone is one of really the only visible, one of the only visible things you can walk around Colchester and know that there was ever a bay trade. You don't have signages, really, but it's a bit difficult to read what this says here. But if we look here, look, it says, here lieth interred the body of Jacob, or we should say Jacob. Here lies interred the body of Jacob Ringer, baize maker, who departed this life January the 20th in the year 1680. This would have been 2 years after the Burial in Woolen Act. Interestingly, we know that this man also lived during the siege of Colchester, and he was one of the many thousands of Dutch people who had to pay half of the fine that Parliament imposed upon Colchester at the time. This is St Martin's Parish Register. You'll see here, if you're doing a family history, you're probably only looking down the left side of the page. These are the names, that's the year, look, 1680. And there's all the people who died and the date that they died. And over on the right-hand side, you've got all this. You think, oh, I'm not interested in that. But that's interesting because that word says affidavit. Affidavit brought, and it's got the date. The date is just missed off here, April. That means affidavit of burial in woolen was brought. The only exception to people having to be buried in wool was people who died of the plague. So they didn't have to comply with that. So, or if you chose not to be buried in wool, some rich people who, you know, literally weren't going to be seen dead wrapped up in wool when they died, wanted to be dressed in their finery, then they had to pay the fine, £5. So if you look down this list and you see your ancestor here, and he hasn't got an affidavit next to his name, well, he may have died of plague, or he may have been wealthy enough to use that as a donation to the poor, because this £5 penalty went to the poor of the parish wherever the person actually lived. But here we can see, although they've spelt his name with a W here, Jacob Ringer, buried January 27, an affidavit was brought sometime early in February. And here is the list of, this is the names of all the Dutch congregation in Colchester and how much they each paid to the £6,000 fine. That they got a bad deal. The town was originally fined £14,000. That was reduced to 12, and the Dutch had to pay half. So although they were only about 10% of the population, they made them pay half of it. And eventually when Fairfax gave £2,000 of the fine back again because the poor were in such dire straits, the Dutch only got £100. But anyway, right at the top of the list, really wealthy, the Tastebill family. George Tastebill in particular paid £500 of that fine himself. But down here, Down the bottom of the list, there's Jacobringer. He paid £10. I mean, you can multiply that by at least 100, for a modern day figure. Mechanization, I just want to touch on this. Eventually, all of these processes were mechanized, really. Spinning frames, roughing machines, carding machines, combing machines, etc. I just want to mention one that in the mid 18th century was a roughing or a rowing mill. You can see an illustration of it down the bottom here. This was going to replace the people who use the little hand bats with the teasers on to raise the nap. And it provided work for, you know, hundreds of local people probably. And what they did, they put these big wheels in. These were massive wheels which were fixed with hundreds, if not thousands, of teasel heads. And they worked originally by horses, but then by electricity or steam, probably steam. And this big wheel spun round and the cloth spun round in the opposite direction. The teasels were doing the job. And in 1762, this is the Minories look, which was owned by Isaac Boggess at the time. He planned to install a rowing mill at his premises, potentially putting a number of men out of work. Now, what happened was this. Well, first of all, let's have a look. There's an example from these museums, the National War Museum, of a rowing mill or roughing mill. You can this is on this one. You can see full of teasel heads, and the cloth is spinning around. The cloth's going in the opposite direction, and it's raising the nap, and then it will automatically trim it all off, probably as well, or into another machine. And there you've got another view here. But anyway, these were difficult times, and this is what Isaac Boggess. Just read this bit. Look, it says, when contemplating installing a rowing mill at his premises in 1762, a letter was put under his door threatening to blow up his house and him and his sons in it if he installed a rowing mill and put a poor man with a large family out of the trade. Now, of course, there's no police. You can't phone the police up, or, you know, there's only a few constables. So what they often did, they offered large rewards. Even the government gave rewards, almost like Crime Stoppers today, to try to deter crime. And Boggess offered £50, a lot of money, and a free pardon to anyone discovering the culprit. No one came forward, and the mill was installed. And I thought you might like to see the original Ipswich Journal, 1762, and this is it's obviously been typed out, the letter. So he says, whereas there was found under my door this morning the following threatening letter, and it says, Boggess, this is to let you know that I will be damned if I don't blow your and your son's brains out. If you ever consent to have a rowing mill, I have a great family, and before I'll see them want, I'll be damned if I don't blow you and your house and all your family to hell. So no more than truth. Now find it out. I'll suffer, but it won't be for nothing. So it obviously, and with all improvements and modernisation and the Industrial Revolution, it is caused problems, and certainly here in Colchester as well, as you can see. The decline of the bay trade, it did start to climb. There were lots of booms, but the slumps were getting longer and longer. The number of bay manufacturers, the clothiers, we can see on the list here, in the early 18th century, there was 100. By 1835, there wasn't any. And you can see, now these are approximate numbers, and over here, these are approximate, but, you know, they're not far off. They show you the trend. And if you look on the number of weavers, you know, in the same period, there was known to be 1,600 weavers in Colchester and the surrounding villages. 1714, 1,500, but then there's a massive slump. 1768, there's only 200. And then it's all to do with war. Wars, prolonged wars with Spain, and the American wars, of course, was a problem. But then after the American war ended in 1782, this post-war boom. There's a massive boom, and you can see in the records here 500 looms pounding away in Colchester, but it was short-lived. And then after that, of course, we had the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, And by the 1930s, there's only one clothier left, and he sold out to a Yorkshire firm in about 1935. Interesting comment made by a French traveller visiting Colchester in 1784. You can see published in this book at the bottom here. And he says, Colchester's trade, like Sudbury's, is very flourishing for a small town. Always more work than workmen. 500 looms clattering. The looms are sent to London in 4 wagons every week, each carrying 250 pieces of cloth. So this was really a boom period, but it was one of these short boom periods, and a longer slump, a permanent slump really, was to follow this. We're near the end now. I just want to share with you something from the Essex Archaeological Transactions. In 1909, there was an article by a man called Henry Laver, and it was entitled The Last Days of Bay Making in Colchester. And in the 1890s, so the bay trade finally finished in Colchester, I say in the 1830s. That was when it finally came to an end. And some of the people who worked in that premise, for that firm in the 1830s, were still alive at the end of the century. They were in Colchester Workhouse. And Henry Laver went into the workhouse and he interviewed a number of these ex-bay workers. He interviewed a weaver, someone who did fulling, and 1 or 2 others. The article runs for about 5 pages, and its interview is oral history, long before we had tape recorders and digital recorders, but this is oral history, asking people questions, writing down their answers. And I recommend, they've got a copy of this in Colchester Public Library. And one of the people interviewed was this man, Charles Baker. He was born in 1817 and he died in 1903, but he was interviewed first of all in 1893 when he was 76 years old. I'm not sure if that was when this picture was taken, but he died in the workhouse in 1903. This is where he worked at Bourne Mill. He speaks about Bourne Mill, and I just want to share finally almost part of what he said. And it says at the bottom, but memories of Charles Baker recorded in 1893 when he was 76 and a resident of Colchester Union Workhouse. Shall we just read this through together? If you follow me through from the top, he says, I was born in Colchester in 1817. When I was 9 years old in 1826, I went to work at Bourne Pond Mill, which was then owned by Mr. Peter Duval, a master baymaker who lived in Priory Street, just below St. James Church. At the mill, I helped with a number of the various processes, including the fulling of the cloth. This was the final process associated with the trade, and it was carried on like this. We folded a piece of bay on the floor so that it made a pile about 1 yard square, and as we did so, we sprinkled it with chamber lye, urine. We used to go round the workhouses and other places to collect the chamber lye, for which we paid a halfpenny a pail. By the following morning, the bays had heated. We then took these and put 2 or 3 pieces at a time under the fulling stocks, large wooden beams which rubbed them in a certain way, thus fulling or thickening them. This rubbing process continued for about half an hour, after which a good stream of water was turned onto the bays to wash them. We used to make the water very foul in fulling. I've seen distillery pond quite white after we'd done. This is just a small part of this fantastic interviews, which you can have a look for yourself. This is probably how Bourne Pond looked when he was working there in the 1830s. And interestingly, I love this picture because over here, there's Bourne Pond Mill, but just in the background, just visible, is Old Heath Windmill. There's only a couple of pictures of Old Heath Windmill known to exist, and it stood up in Whitehall Road. This is the view today. And Bourne Pond today, it's a National Trust building, as you know. It's the only National Trust building actually in Colchester. And they're very conscious of their history in the bay trade and being a fulling mill. And what they have done, they have rigged up these fulling stocks, if you like. So here we've got the stocks here, and they've set it up with pedal power. And when children from schools come to visit, they get them, they can actually full the cloth. These hammers go up and down. There's the cloth there, look. If you haven't seen that, pop along to Bourne Pond Mill. That's where we're going to finish. If you'd like to find out a bit more, there's lots of books, but on the left, this is my Colchester workbook. There's a whole chapter on the cloth trade in there. And on the right, Essex at Work by Arthur Brown. You'll see down the bottom here, his opening chapter also is about the cloth trade, mainly in Colchester, but also Essex. And down the bottom, you'll also find lots of information in the Essex County History for Essex, particularly volumes 2 and volume 9. So that's where I'm going to close. Hope that's been of some interest to you.